When Dr. Marcus Bailey, a successful black doctor, is targeted by a small-town sheriff, what begins as subtle harassment quickly spirals into blatant racism and abuse of power. Despite his accomplishments, Marcus is treated as an outsider, subjected to intimidation, threats, and the invasion of his home. The sheriff's prejudice runs deep, reflecting the systemic racism that allows figures like him to thrive unchecked. As Marcus faces humiliation and escalating tension, the story exposes the harsh reality of being judged not by merit, but by race, leaving the audience outraged and desperate for justice. Elena Torres adjusted her crisp navy blazer as she stepped into the conference room, her heels clicking against the polished floor. The walls gleamed with modern glass panels, the kind that made even whispers seem loud. She exhaled slowly, steadying the flutter in her chest. Today was supposed to be a victory. After 8 years of late nights, perfect performance reviews, and doing twice the work for half the credit, she was about to become the youngest regional manager at Brenson Enterprises. The room was already occupied by her direct supervisor, Thomas Hughes, a man with salt and pepper hair and an easy smile that rarely reached his eyes. He leaned back in a chair at the head of the table, the portrait of corporate confidence. "Elena, have a seat," he said, motioning to the chair directly across from him. His voice was calm, polite, but Elena detected something hidden beneath it. Hesitation. No, it was colder than that. "Thank you," Elena replied, her voice measured as she took her seat and smoothed her skirt. She'd earned this moment, no nerves would betray her. Thomas cleared his throat and shuffled the papers in front of him. "First, I want to acknowledge your hard work and dedication to this company. You've consistently exceeded expectations, and your contributions have been noteworthy." Noteworthy. Elena's stomach twisted slightly. The word felt like a prelude to something she wouldn't like. He continued. "That said, there's been a complication regarding the promotion." "Complication?" Elena repeated, her brows furrowing. She kept her voice even, though unease prickled at her. She couldn't have heard that correctly. "Yes." Thomas leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. "We've decided to award the position to someone else. It's nothing personal. We just feel that this decision aligns better with the company's current goals." Silence crashed into the room like a wave. Elena blinked once, twice. "Someone else?" Her voice came out quieter than she intended, but it was steady. "With all due respect, Mr. Hughes, I was told the position was practically guaranteed. My qualifications, performance." Thomas held up a hand to cut her off. "I understand your frustration, but the decision is final." Frustration wasn't the right word. Elena felt something sharper blooming in her chest. "Who did you give it to?" she asked carefully. Thomas hesitated, and then said the name. "Jason Brooks." The room tilted slightly. Jason Brooks, her colleague. A man who'd joined the company 2 years ago and spent more time taking credit for team projects than leading them. A man who, only last month, had asked her for help drafting a report. Elena clenched her jaw, forcing herself to maintain her composure. "May I ask why Jason was selected over me? I'd like to understand." Thomas's smile faltered slightly. "Jason has qualities that align with leadership," he said vaguely. "He's a better cultural fit for the direction we're headed." A better cultural fit. There it was. The words that said everything without saying anything. Elena's hands gripped the edges of her chair as realization sank in. This wasn't about performance or qualifications, it wasn't about Jason being better, it was about who they were willing to see in power, and it wasn't her. The silence lingered for a beat too long before Thomas stood, smoothing his tie. "Take the day to collect your thoughts. I'm sure you'll see this as a growth opportunity in the long run." Elena didn't stand. She couldn't trust her legs. Instead, she watched as Thomas left the room, his carefully curated authority trailing behind him. Alone now, Elena stared at the empty chair across the table, Jason's name echoing in her head. This wasn't just a loss, it was a line being drawn. A choice they had made, not because she wasn't enough, but because she wasn't who they wanted. But they had underestimated her. Slowly, Elena rose, her heels clicking against the same polished floor as she walked to the window. The city stretched out below her. unapologetic and unrelenting, much like she would be. "They're going to regret this," she murmured to herself, a spark of steel igniting in her chest. This wasn't over. It was only the beginning. The bell chimed softly as Dr. Marcus Bailey stepped into McLean's diner, the door swinging shut behind him. The scent of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the faint tang of bacon grease. A reminder that some places never changed, no matter how much the world outside them did. Marcus paused just inside the door, taking in the small-town relic. The worn leather booths, cracked linoleum floors, and framed photographs of Little League teams yellowing on the walls. This wasn't a place you went to see or be seen. That was what he liked about it. Marcus adjusted the sleeves of his charcoal gray sweater, a far cry from the tailored suits and crisp white coats he typically wore. It wasn't the kind of outfit that screamed Chief of Cardiac Surgery at Lakeview Memorial Hospital, but that was the point. Here, he wasn't Dr. Bailey, the celebrated surgeon whose name carried weight in boardrooms and medical journals. He was just Marcus, 6'2", with graying temples and a quiet demeanor that could make him seem older than his 43 years. To those who didn't know him, he was no different than any other man stopping in for breakfast. "Morning," he said, offering a polite nod to the older woman behind the counter. Dolores McLean didn't return the greeting, her focus firmly fixed on the register as she muttered under her breath. Her salt and pepper curls bobbed with agitation, her frown deepening as she punched a series of buttons on the machine. Marcus didn't take it personally. Dolores was a constant here, a fixture behind the counter for nearly 40 years. She wasn't rude, just practical. That's how small-town folk were, politeness reserved for familiar faces. "Take a seat anywhere," she grumbled. Marcus chose a booth near the window, its cracked pleather seat groaning beneath his weight. Outside, Main Street stirred to life. Sunlight streamed through the window, glinting off a line of pickup trucks and sedans parked haphazardly along the curb. Across the street, the hardware store sign flickered as a teenage boy attempted to replace a light bulb, his father's instructions booming through the quiet morning. The scene was ordinary, timeless in its simplicity, and yet, Marcus knew there were lines here, unspoken but razor-sharp. Lines of class, race, and expectation. You stayed on your side, played your role, and life rolled on, just as it always had. "Coffee?" The voice startled him slightly. He looked up to find a young waitress standing at the edge of the table, a pot of coffee in hand. Her name tag read, Maddie, and she couldn't have been more than 19. Her ponytail hung loose, and her apron was stained at the edges. "Yes, please," Marcus replied, his voice low but warm. Maddie filled his cup with a steady hand, not meeting his gaze as she spoke. "You passing through town?" Marcus smiled faintly, accustomed to the question. Places like this had a way of looking at you sideways when you didn't fit their mold. "No, I live here. Well, near here, about 10 miles outside of town." That got her attention. Her gaze flickered up to meet his, curiosity sparking behind her tired expression. "Oh. What do you do?" "I'm a surgeon." Maddie blinked once, her brows knitting together, as if she hadn't heard him right. She glanced at his sweater, his relaxed jeans, no outward sign of someone who spent his days repairing human hearts. "A doctor," she repeated, her tone uncertain. "Yes," Marcus replied, his voice even. He was used to this. People didn't picture surgeons like him, tall, black and unassuming in a small-town diner. They expected starched collars, sleek cars, and voices that carried a subtle air of condescension. Marcus had worked hard to shatter those stereotypes, though that didn't mean they weren't still alive and well. Maddie shifted her weight awkwardly, as though unsure how to respond. "Well, that's nice," she said finally. "Eggs and toast okay for you?" "That'll be fine. Thank you." As Maddie disappeared into the kitchen, Marcus sipped his coffee, the bitterness grounding him. He stared absently out the window, watching the world go by in lazy increments. A mother and her young son emerged from the bakery next door, the boy tugging eagerly at the white paper bag she held. Further down the street, 2 men in Carhartt jackets laughed as they leaned against the hood of a truck, cups of gas station coffee in hand. It was an ordinary day for everyone but Marcus. He had come to McLean's for solitude, a brief respite before the chaos of the hospital consumed him again. His weeks were spent performing 12-hour surgeries, managing the department, and fielding offers for interviews he had little interest in giving. He didn't mind the hard work, he had been built for it. What Marcus minded was the distance, the invisible wall between himself and others who could never quite see past his success to the person beneath. The diner door swung open again, the bell's soft jingle cutting through his thoughts. A man in a crisp button-down shirt entered, phone pressed to his ear as he spoke in clipped tones. Marcus glanced up briefly and recognized the man immediately. Dean Holloway, the bank manager who oversaw the local branch just down the road. Dean spotted Marcus, and for a moment, something unreadable flashed across his face. Then he turned away, settling at the counter and motioning for Dolores's attention. Marcus sighed quietly. He knew what Dean saw. A black man in his 40s sitting alone in a diner that didn't often welcome strangers. Dean wouldn't have cared if Marcus had rolled up in a Mercedes or a beat-up truck. Men like Dean always looked for reasons to doubt someone like him. The quiet tension in the diner began to build as Dolores moved between the tables, her movements sharp and brisk. Maddie returned moments later, balancing Marcus's plate with practiced precision. "Here you go," she said, setting the eggs and toast down in front of him. "Thank you." Marcus began to eat in silence, savoring the familiar comfort of food prepared without pretense. Around him, the low hum of conversation filled the air, soft laughter from the group near the counter, Dolores muttering to herself as she scribbled numbers into a notepad. But then, something shifted. It was small at first, a lull in the hum of voices, as though someone had turned the volume down. Marcus glanced up and noticed Dean Holloway watching him again, this time with a frown tugging at the corner of his mouth. He said something to Dolores, who turned her head to look at Marcus with a similar expression of suspicion. Marcus set down his fork, his appetite evaporating. He'd seen that look before. What's he doing here? He doesn't belong. Dolores walked slowly toward him, wiping her hands on a stained dish rag. When she stopped at the edge of his table, Marcus met her gaze evenly. "Something wrong?" he asked, keeping his tone polite. Dolores's lips pursed tightly, and she glanced at Dean as though seeking approval before speaking. "You're not from around here, are you?" Marcus tilted his head slightly, his calm expression betraying nothing. "I told your waitress earlier, I live just outside of town." Her frown deepened. "Funny, I've never seen you before." Marcus set his hands on the table, his voice soft but firm. "I keep to myself." Dolores didn't respond immediately. She looked him over, her gaze lingering on his hands. Hands that, despite their strength, bore faint scars from years of surgeries. Finally, she said, "Well, we don't want any trouble here." The words hung in the air, each syllable laced with meaning. Marcus didn't flinch, but his jaw tightened imperceptibly. He had spent years navigating moments like this, subtle accusations that carried the weight of old wounds. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Marcus replied evenly. "Good." Dolores nodded, though she didn't look convinced. She turned and walked back to the counter, leaving Marcus staring at the empty space where she'd stood. As he picked up his coffee again, he couldn't help but notice how the energy in the diner had shifted. Conversations resumed, but quieter now, and he could feel eyes flicking toward him when they thought he wouldn't notice. "Here we go again," he thought bitterly. Outside the diner window, the world continued to spin, as if nothing had happened. But Marcus knew better. The tension he felt now was only the beginning. Marcus took another slow sip of his coffee, his gaze fixed on the half-empty diner. He tried to ignore the prickling sensation that came with being watched, but his instincts, honed through decades of subtle slights and coded remarks, told him what was happening. He knew the looks, the whispers, the quiet judgment, masquerading as concern. He'd seen it before, in boardrooms, parking lots, even the halls of hospitals where lives hung in the balance. The bell chimed again. Two men entered, their footsteps heavy against the floor. Sheriff Greg Tanner and his deputy Kyle Thompson. Marcus knew their faces from the local paper. Tanner was a broad man with a belly that hung over his belt, and a sharp squint that gave him the perpetual look of suspicion. Kyle, younger and lankier, followed like a shadow. They didn't sit down. Instead, they went straight to the counter, where Dolores stood whispering with Dean Holloway. The moment the sheriff's gaze settled on Marcus, Marcus knew what came next. "Morning, Dolores." Tanner's voice was loud and casual, but he wasn't looking at her. His eyes stayed on Marcus, as if gauging him from a distance. Dolores leaned closer to whisper something, and Tanner gave a slow nod. "I see." He turned fully now, his heavy boots thudding, as he crossed the diner toward Marcus's table, his deputy close behind. Marcus didn't move. He let the sheriff come to him, meeting his gaze with a calm, unreadable expression as the two men loomed over the booth. "Morning," Tanner said, though there was nothing warm about the greeting. "Morning, Sheriff," Marcus replied, setting his coffee down. Tanner tilted his head, his squint sharpening. "You new in town?" "No. I live about 10 miles out, off Route 15. "That right?" Tanner said slowly, his tone doubtful. He thumbed his belt and let the silence stretch between them. "Got yourself a name?" Marcus's jaw tightened slightly, but he kept his voice level. "Marcus Bailey." "Uh-huh. And what brings you to McLean's this morning, Mr. Bailey?" Tanner asked, his tone carrying just a shade too much authority. "Breakfast," Marcus said simply. Tanner didn't seem satisfied. He glanced back at Dolores and Dean, as if confirming their silent accusations, before turning his attention back to Marcus. "Don't mind me asking, but you look like someone I haven't seen around these parts before." "That's because I keep to myself," Marcus replied. He could feel the tension building now, subtle, but suffocating. "Is there a problem, Sheriff?" Tanner sniffed, his chest puffing out just slightly. "Depends, folks around here get nervous when they see someone unfamiliar hanging around, especially when they're—" He paused, as if searching for the right word. "Out of place." There it was. Marcus's jaw clenched briefly, the words cutting through the thin veneer of politeness. "I'm not out of place, Sheriff. I'm sitting here having breakfast like everyone else." Kyle Thompson shifted uneasily beside the sheriff, his gaze darting between Tanner and Marcus. The younger man looked uncomfortable, as if he could sense the tension spiraling, but he didn't dare speak up. "You mind showing me some ID, Mr. Bailey?" Tanner said finally, his voice taking on a harder edge. Marcus set his fork down, his movements deliberate. "Is there a reason you're asking for my ID? Am I under suspicion for something?" Tanner smiled faintly, though it was more a baring of teeth than a true smile. "Just trying to make sure everything's in order. You know how it is, routine." Routine. Marcus knew better. He had every right to refuse, but he also knew that refusing would escalate this faster than it already was. This was a game Tanner played, a way to flex his authority, and Marcus could feel every pair of eyes in the diner watching closely. Slowly, Marcus reached into his back pocket, pulled out his wallet, and handed over his driver's license. Tanner took it, glancing at the ID before holding it just a little too long, as if studying it for a flaw that didn't exist. "Marcus Bailey," Tanner murmured, his squint deepening. "Says here you're a doctor." "I am." Tanner raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Is that so?" "It is," Marcus replied, his voice clipped now. "Chief of Cardiac Surgery at Lakeview Memorial." For a brief second, Tanner's expression faltered, but he recovered quickly. "Well, that's something," he muttered. He handed the ID back, his gaze lingering on Marcus, as though searching for a reason to press further. Kyle Thompson shifted again, speaking for the first time. "Sheriff, I don't think there's a—" Tanner shot him a sharp look, cutting him off. "Why don't you go check the cruiser, Kyle?" Kyle hesitated, but nodded. "Yes, sir." He turned and walked back toward the door, leaving Tanner and Marcus alone in the quiet tension of the diner. "Anything else, Sheriff?" Marcus asked. Tanner studied him for a moment longer, as though still sizing him up. Finally, he shrugged. "Guess not." He turned and began walking back toward the counter. "You enjoy your breakfast, Dr. Bailey." The sarcasm in his voice wasn't lost on Marcus. As Tanner rejoined Dolores and Dean, Marcus let out a slow breath, his pulse thrumming in his ears. He glanced around the diner. No one met his gaze, but he could feel their stares. Marcus finished his coffee, leaving the rest of his breakfast untouched. He'd lost his appetite. After paying at the register, Dolores snatching the bills without a word, he stepped outside into the brisk morning air. The sunlight no longer felt warm. Marcus walked toward his car, a simple black sedan parked near the edge of the lot. As he approached, He noticed the deputy leaning against the hood, his hands shoved in his pockets. Kyle straightened when he saw Marcus, guilt flickering across his face. "Sheriff send you out here?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but cold. Kyle shook his head quickly. "No, sir, I just—" He scratched the back of his neck, looking uncomfortable. "Look, I'm sorry about that in there. Sheriff Tanner can be intense sometimes." Marcus opened the driver's side door, pausing to look at the young man. "Let me give you some advice, Deputy Thompson. You don't have to follow a bad example just because it's the only one you've seen." Kyle's face reddened slightly, and he looked away. "Yes, sir," he murmured. Without another word, Marcus got into his car and shut the door. The moment he was alone, his hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. For years, he had carried himself with composure and patience, refusing to let anger control him. But today, sitting in that diner, having his presence questioned and his dignity undermined, the fury burned just beneath his calm exterior. He took a deep breath and exhaled slowly, forcing his hands to relax. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened, and deep down, he knew it wouldn't be the last, but it didn't make it any easier. As he started the engine and pulled out of the lot, Marcus glanced in the rearview mirror. Sheriff Tanner stood outside the diner with Dean Holloway, their heads bent together as they spoke. Tanner looked up, his squint following Marcus's car until it disappeared down the street. "They want me to disappear," Marcus thought bitterly. "But I'm not going anywhere." The hum of the engine filled the silence as he turned onto Route 15, the road stretching wide and empty ahead of him. The tension from the morning sat heavy in his chest, but alongside it was something sharper: resolve. "They think I don't belong here," he thought, gripping the wheel tighter. "I'll show them just how wrong they are." The faint hum of the engine filled the car as Marcus sped down Route 15, his mind churning. His hands gripped the steering wheel, the tension from McLean's diner still gnawing at him. He replayed Tanner's smug expression and Dolores's unspoken accusations over and over in his head. "Out of place," Tanner had said, as though his very existence was a disruption. Marcus turned onto the long gravel driveway that led to his property. Nestled on 10 quiet acres, his home was a testament to years of relentless work, a modern farmhouse with tall windows that overlooked rolling green fields. The irony wasn't lost on him. In a place where he'd built a life that most would envy, his peace was still conditional. He parked the car and stepped out, the gravel crunching underfoot. The air was still, the morning sunlight dappled through the oaks that lined his property. For a moment, he let the silence settle around him, closing his eyes and breathing deeply. He needed to cool off. But peace was a fleeting thing. The faint rumble of tires on gravel broke the quiet, and Marcus's head snapped up. A sheriff's cruiser appeared at the bend, its headlights off, but its presence unmistakable. Marcus's jaw tightened as the car rolled to a stop a few yards away. The door opened, and Tanner stepped out, his boots hitting the gravel with deliberate slowness. Behind him, Kyle Thompson emerged, his shoulders hunched as though bracing for a storm. Marcus stood his ground. "Something I can help you with, Sheriff?" Tanner adjusted his belt and gave a slow, almost mocking smile. "Just following up, Dr. Bailey." "Following up on what?" Marcus's voice was steady, but there was an edge to it now. Tanner didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced toward the house, taking in the wide porch and pristine exterior. "Nice place you got here, must have cost a fortune." Marcus's stomach turned. "This isn't about my house." He thought Tanner's game was clearer now. He wasn't just questioning Marcus's presence in town, he was questioning everything about him, his success, his worthiness. "Get to the point, Sheriff," Marcus said evenly. Tanner's expression hardened. "We got a call about a suspicious vehicle leaving McLean's diner this morning." Marcus stared at him, incredulous. "A suspicious vehicle? You mean my car?" Tanner shrugged, feigning indifference. "Folks get nervous when they see someone acting out of place." Marcus's fists clenched at his sides, his pulse thrumming in his ears. "This is harassment," he said, his voice low but sharp. Tanner's smile returned, this time colder. "I'm just doing my job, making sure everything checks out." Kyle Thompson shifted uncomfortably behind him, his gaze darting between Marcus and Tanner. Marcus caught the hesitation in his posture, the unease in his eyes, but Kyle said nothing. "You're on my property," Marcus said, taking a step closer. "Unless you have a warrant, you're trespassing. I'd suggest you leave." Tanner's expression darkened. "Careful, Dr. Bailey. It doesn't take much to escalate things." "Is that a threat?" "Not at all," Tanner replied, his tone dripping with mock innocence. "But I wouldn't want any misunderstandings. You know how things can get complicated." Marcus could feel his control slipping, his anger bubbling dangerously close to the surface. But he forced himself to remain calm. "They want a reaction," he thought. "Don't give them one." Instead, he took a deep breath and spoke clearly. "If you don't leave my property immediately, I'll be calling my attorney, and I'll make sure the department knows about this visit." For a split second, Tanner's facade cracked, but he quickly recovered. He gave Marcus a long, assessing look before turning back to the cruiser. "Suit yourself," he said, his voice casual. "Just doing my due diligence." He climbed into the car, slamming the door harder than necessary. Kyle followed, though not before casting Marcus a quick, almost apologetic glance. The engine roared to life, and the cruiser rolled away, the crunch of gravel fading into the distance. Marcus stood there, his fists still clenched, his body rigid with anger. He watched the car disappear from view before turning back toward the house. His mind was racing. Inside, Marcus paced the living room, his footsteps echoing off the hardwood floors. The walls, lined with bookshelves and family photos, felt smaller than they had before, like they were closing in on him. He grabbed his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in months. After 2 rings, a familiar voice answered. "Marcus?" "Mitchell, I need your help," Marcus said, his voice tight. Mitchell Ford had been Marcus's college roommate, and, later, his most trusted attorney. The two had remained close over the years, though Marcus rarely called unless it was serious. "What's going on?" Mitchell's tone shifted, sensing the urgency. "I've got a problem," Marcus said, recounting the events of the morning, the diner, the sheriff, and the blatant harassment on his property. "They're looking for a reason to pin something on me. I can feel it." Mitchell was silent for a moment before speaking. "You need to document everything. Dates, times, names, everything they've done. I'll start looking into Tanner's background. There's no way this is the first time he's pulled something like this." Marcus ran a hand over his face, trying to steady his nerves. "This can't go on. I've spent my whole life building something for myself, and they're trying to tear it down for no reason other than—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "I get it, Marcus," Mitchell said softly. "And we're not going to let them win. I'll get on this today, but you need to be careful. Don't give them any excuses to escalate." Marcus exhaled sharply, nodding, even though Mitchell couldn't see him. "Thanks, Mitch. Hang in there, I'll call you back soon." Marcus ended the call and stared at his phone for a moment. Then, as if on instinct, he opened the camera app and began photographing the tire tracks on his driveway, the sheriff's unwelcome visit documented. He wasn't going to let this slide. That afternoon, Marcus drove into town to meet with Mitchell's local contact, a private investigator named Terrence Hill. Marcus had known of Terrence's work for years, thorough, discreet, and not one to back down. They met in a quiet cafe on the edge of town, where the staff knew better than to interrupt private conversations. Terrence, a wiry man with sharp eyes and a notebook perpetually in hand, wasted no time. "This sheriff," Terrence said, his pen moving rapidly, "has a reputation. Tanner's had more than a few complaints filed against him. Allegations of racial profiling, harassment, and overreach. Problem is, nothing sticks." "Because no one pushes back," Marcus said quietly. Terrence nodded. "Exactly, small-town politics keep him insulated, but if we get enough to expose a pattern, complaints, witnesses, anything, we can blow this wide open." Marcus leaned forward, his voice low. "I don't want just rumors. I need proof, something they can't sweep under the rug." Terrence gave him a sharp grin. "That's what I do, Doc. I'll dig, and when I find something, you'll be the first to know." Marcus left the cafe feeling a flicker of hope, small but significant. For the first time, it felt like he wasn't fighting this battle alone. But as he walked to his car, that hope evaporated. The sheriff's cruiser sat parked across the street. Tanner was inside, his squinting eyes fixed on Marcus, like a hawk watching prey. Marcus froze, their gazes locking for a tense, silent moment. Tanner didn't move, didn't speak. He just sat there, his presence a warning. "I'm watching you," Marcus's pulse pounded, but he refused to look away. Instead, he unlocked his car, climbed in, and drove off. Tanner's reflection shrinking in the rearview mirror. The message was clear. Tanner wasn't done, but neither was Marcus. Let him watch, Marcus thought. Because when this is over, he's going to wish he hadn't. Marcus didn't go straight home after leaving the cafe. Instead, he drove aimlessly for a while, the miles ticking by as his thoughts churned. Tanner's cruiser had been a message, one meant to intimidate, but it had the opposite effect. If Tanner wanted to test Marcus's resolve, he was about to find out just how deep it ran. The sun had begun to dip below the horizon when Marcus finally turned back onto Route 15. His phone buzzed in the passenger seat, the name Mitchell lighting up the screen. He grabbed it, answering on speaker as he kept his eyes on the road. "Marcus, it's me. I've been digging into Tanner," Mitchell said, his voice urgent. "Turns out he's got more dirt than I expected. Civil complaints swept under the rug, a harassment suit that got settled quietly 2 years ago. This guy's a ticking time bomb." Marcus's jaw tightened. "And no one's held him accountable?" "No. But this time's different, Marcus. You're different. You've got resources, a platform. If we move quickly, we can take him down before he does something worse." Marcus nodded, gripping the wheel tighter. "Do what you need to, Mitch. We're not letting this go." "Be careful," Mitchell warned. "Guys like Tanner. They don't like being exposed. He's going to push back hard." Marcus hung up, his mind already racing. The thought of Tanner harassing someone else, someone without the means to fight back, galvanized him. He's gotten away with it long enough, Marcus thought. Not anymore. It was fully dark by the time Marcus pulled into his driveway. The headlights swept across his house, illuminating the porch and the tall oaks that stood like sentinels. He turned off the engine, grabbing his briefcase and locking the car. The night air was cooler now, and the only sounds were the faint chirping of crickets. Marcus had just stepped onto the porch when he noticed something off. The lock on the front door glinted strangely in the faint light. He froze, his body going still, as dread tightened in his chest. The lock had been tampered with. Heart pounding, Marcus reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the emergency dial. Slowly, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The house was dark, save for the faint slivers of moonlight streaming through the windows. Marcus moved carefully, his senses heightened. The living room was untouched. So was the hallway. But when he reached his study, his stomach dropped. Papers were strewn across the floor. The desk drawers had been yanked open, their contents dumped in messy piles. Books had been pulled from the shelves, their pages bent and torn. Someone had been looking for something. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. He backed out of the study, his phone already dialing. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. 911, what's your emergency? This is Dr. Marcus Bailey, he said, forcing his voice to remain calm. My house has been broken into. I need an officer sent out immediately. Stay on the line, sir. Are you in a safe location? For now, Marcus replied, his eyes scanning the darkened hallway. Minutes later, the distant sound of sirens broke the silence. Marcus stepped outside onto the porch, relief washing over him as flashing blue and red lights approached. A patrol car skidded to a stop at the edge of his driveway, and 2 officers stepped out. The first was Kyle Thompson. Marcus exhaled sharply at the sight of him, though Kyle's expression was uneasy. The second officer, however, made Marcus's blood run cold. It was Tanner. The sheriff climbed out of the cruiser, his expression hard and unreadable. "Evening, Dr. Bailey," Tanner said, his tone laced with mock politeness. "Heard you had a little trouble tonight." Marcus didn't respond, his gaze fixed on Tanner. "You're the one they sent?" Tanner smirked. "Well, it's my jurisdiction. Mind if we take a look?" Marcus felt his fists clench at his sides, but he stepped aside. Kyle shot him a quick, nervous glance as they moved into the house. Tanner leading the way, Marcus followed, his pulse pounding as the 2 officers surveyed the damage. "Looks like someone was searching for something," Kyle murmured, bending to pick up a scattered document. Tanner gave a slow nod, but his expression remained unreadable. "Happens more than you'd think. Sometimes folks think houses like these have valuables lying around. Could be kids looking for cash." Marcus bristled. There's nothing missing. Whoever broke in wasn't looking for money. Tanner turned to face him, his squint narrowing. You sure about that? Seems like a stretch. Marcus stared him down, his voice low. This isn't random, Sheriff. Tanner tilted his head, that smug smile curling at the edge of his mouth. Now, let's not jump to conclusions, Doc, unless, of course, you've got something to hide. Marcus's anger flared, but he reined it in. Don't patronize me, Tanner. Someone broke into my home, and I expect you to do your job. Tanner took a step closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Careful, Bailey. You're starting to sound like you're accusing me of something. Marcus didn't blink. If the shoe fits. For a moment, the two men locked eyes, the tension so thick it felt suffocating. Kyle, still kneeling near the scattered papers, shifted uncomfortably. Sheriff, maybe we should... Quiet, Kyle. Tanner snapped without looking away from Marcus. Marcus held his ground, refusing to look away. He's testing me, Marcus realized, trying to break me down. Finally, Tanner straightened, breaking the moment. We'll file a report, he said casually. But don't get your hopes up. Cases like this, they don't usually go anywhere. Marcus's jaw tightened. I'll follow up with the department tomorrow. You do that? Tanner said, smirking as he turned toward the door. Kyle lingered briefly, giving Marcus an apologetic look before following his boss outside. As the cruiser pulled away, its taillights disappearing into the dark, Marcus felt a fresh wave of resolve harden inside him. Tanner had overplayed his hand. This wasn't subtle anymore. It was personal. Marcus sat at his kitchen table, the dim light overhead casting sharp shadows across the room. His laptop was open, documents spread in neat piles around him as he worked late into the night. Every scrap of evidence Mitchell had sent him, every detail about Tanner's complaints and buried misconduct. It was all here. The break-in hadn't rattled him. It had lit a fire under him. You want to intimidate me? Tanner, Marcus thought, his fingers typing furiously. You're going to regret that. As he compiled the evidence, his phone buzzed with a message from Mitchell. Mitchell. We've got something. Call me first thing tomorrow. Tanner's buried deeper than we thought. Marcus stared at the screen, his heart pounding. He didn't need to wait until morning. He knew what he had to do. He picked up his phone and scrolled to Terrence Hill's number. When the PI answered, Marcus's voice was steady, but cold. Terrence, it's Marcus. I need you to put everything you've got on Tanner into a file tonight. I want it ready to go public. You sure about that? Terrence asked, his voice cautious. Absolutely, Marcus replied. Send it to the press, the state board, the mayor. I don't care, I want this out there. Terrence hesitated for only a second before answering. You got it, Doc? It'll be ready by morning. Marcus ended the call and leaned back in his chair, staring at the documents spread before him. This was it, the moment where everything would come to a head. Tanner wanted to intimidate him, to push him out, to remind him that men like Marcus weren't welcome here. But Tanner had miscalculated. Marcus wasn't backing down. The next morning, Marcus woke to a flurry of phone notifications, news alerts, emails, missed calls. He grabbed his phone, his heart racing as he read the first headline. Sheriff under investigation. Allegations of harassment, misconduct surface. Marcus exhaled sharply, a mix of relief and vindication flooding through him. Terrence had come through, Mitchell had come through. The truth was out, and Tanner couldn't hide from it now. But even as Marcus stood, his phone rang again. He glanced at the screen. Mitchell. Morning, Marcus said as he answered. Marcus? Mitchell's voice was sharp, urgent. You need to get out of there now. Marcus froze. What are you talking about? Tanner's not going quietly, Mitchell said. I just got word from my contact. He's coming after you. You need to be careful. Before Marcus could respond, the sound of tires on gravel cut through the air outside. He turned to the window. A sheriff's cruiser had pulled into his driveway. Tanner stepped out, his face dark with fury, his hand resting on the holstered gun at his hip. Marcus's pulse thundered in his ears as he watched Tanner move toward the house. This wasn't over. Not yet. The cruiser's headlights sliced through the early morning mist as Tanner parked in Marcus's driveway. The hum of the engine lingered for a moment before it cut off, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Marcus stood by his front window, heart pounding, as he watched the sheriff climb out, every step deliberate, a predator closing in. Tanner's hand hovered near his holstered weapon, his posture radiating menace. Marcus's pulse thundered in his ears, but his mind was clear. This was it. The moment Tanner had been pushing him toward Marcus wasn't going to run. Not now. He grabbed his phone and stuffed it into his back pocket before walking to the front door. The air outside was still, heavy with the coming confrontation. As Marcus stepped onto the porch, Tanner was already halfway up the steps, his boots thudding against the wood. "Morning, Dr. Bailey," Tanner said, his tone mockingly cheerful. "You're up early, planning another busy day?" Marcus didn't flinch, didn't blink. "What do you want, Tanner?" Tanner's smirk faded. "You know exactly what I want. I don't appreciate the little show you and your buddies put on last night, dragging my name through the mud. That was a mistake." "You did that yourself," Marcus shot back. "The truth's finally catching up to you." Tanner took another step forward, his bulk blocking the sunlight behind him. His hand lingered on the edge of his belt, near the gun. "You think you can waltz into this town, play the victim, and ruin a man's life because you didn't like being questioned I was doing my job?" Marcus's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed calm. Your job is to protect and serve. Instead, you harass and intimidate anyone who doesn't look like they belong in your little world." Tanner's eyes darkened, his nostrils flaring. "Watch yourself, Bailey." Marcus took a step down toward him, leveling the playing field. "Or what you'll lie again, plant something on me to make me fit your narrative. That's what cowards do, Tanner. They abuse their power because they're afraid of losing it." Tanner's face turned a dangerous shade of red, and for a split second, Marcus thought the man might actually draw his weapon. The tension in the air was so thick, it felt like it might snap. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" Tanner spat, his voice low and venomous. "Because of your fancy job, your fancy house. You think that changes what you are?" Marcus's blood ran cold, but his resolve sharpened. He took another step, meeting Tanner's hateful gaze head on. "I know I'm better than you, Tanner, not because of what I have, but because I don't need to tear others down to feel important." "Careful," Tanner hissed, his hand twitching near his holster. "One wrong move, and this ends badly for you." Marcus stood tall, his voice unwavering. "If you're going to do something, Tanner, do it, but I promise you this, whatever happens next, I'll make sure the whole world sees who you really are." Tanner's eyes flickered with something primal. Rage, fear, or perhaps a mix of both. He opened his mouth to respond, but the sound of gravel crunching interrupted him. Both men turned sharply as a second car pulled into the driveway. A sleek black sedan rolled to a stop, and the door swung open. Marcus felt a rush of relief as Mitchell stepped out, wearing his usual suit, and a look of calm intensity. He held a leather folder in one hand, and his phone in the other, and his gaze landed on Tanner with a chill that could have frozen the sun. "Sheriff Tanner," Mitchell said, his voice smooth but commanding. "How fortunate I was hoping to speak with you." Tanner stiffened, his shoulders rising defensively. "And who the hell are you?" "Mitchell Ford, attorney." Mitchell's smile was faint and humorless. "I represent Dr. Bailey." Marcus watched Tanner's facade crack ever so slightly, his squint narrowing as though assessing the new threat. "This is a private matter, and you're trespassing," Tanner growled. "Is it a private matter?" Mitchell asked, his voice sharp now. "Because from where I'm standing it looks like harassment again." "That's quite a pattern for you, isn't it, Sheriff?" Tanner bristled, his composure fraying. "This is my jurisdiction. I don't need to explain myself to you." "You will," Mitchell replied, stepping closer. He held up the folder in his hand, flipping it open. "I have evidence, sheriff complaints filed against you for misconduct, racial profiling, abuse of authority, you name it. And now this morning, we have video evidence of you trespassing on private property and threatening a respected doctor. Would you like to see it? Because I'd be happy to forward it to the state attorney general's office." Tanner's face drained of color. He turned back to Marcus, his voice a low growl. "You set me up." Marcus shook his head. "No, Tanner. You did this to yourself." Mitchell stepped forward, pressing his advantage. "Here's what's going to happen, Sheriff. You're going to leave this property right now, you're not going to come back, and you're not going to contact Dr. Bailey again. If you don't, I'll personally make sure every one of those complaints sees the light of day. I'll have reporters here by noon, and by the time I'm done, your career will be over." Tanner's chest heaved, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. For a moment, Marcus thought the man might lash out, say something, do something that would seal his fate forever. But then the fight drained from his shoulders, replaced by something hollow. "Be careful, Bailey," Tanner said, his voice low and bitter. "You don't know what you've started." Marcus didn't respond, he just held Tanner's gaze, unflinching, as the sheriff turned on his heel and stomped back toward his cruiser. The slam of the car door reverberated like a gunshot as Tanner pulled out of the driveway, tires spitting gravel as he sped off into the distance. The silence that followed felt heavy and raw. Marcus let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Mitchell turned to him, his expression softening. "You okay?" Marcus nodded slowly. "I will be, thank you, Mitchell." Mitchell gave a small smile and clapped Marcus on the shoulder. "This isn't over. You know Tanner's going to come apart, and when he does, we'll need to be ready." "I'll be ready," Marcus replied firmly. He turned to look out over his property, the sun breaking through the early mist in soft, golden streaks. Tanner was exposed now, his threats and intimidation laid bare. But Marcus knew this was only the beginning. Tanner was a symptom, not the cause. The system that had protected him would fight back, and Marcus would have to be stronger than ever. But for the first time in days, Marcus felt a deep, unshakable resolve settle in his chest. Tanner had pushed him to the edge, but Marcus hadn't broken. He had stood his ground, and now, he was ready for the fight that lay ahead. Inside the house, Marcus picked up his phone and opened his messages. He tapped a conversation with Mitchell and began typing. "Marcus, let's go public with everything. The complaints, the evidence, all of it. I'm done staying quiet." Within seconds, Mitchell replied. "Mitchell, it's already in motion." Marcus looked out the window one last time. Tanner's threat still echoing faintly in his mind. But it didn't matter. Not anymore. For years, he had tried to keep his head down, to let his work speak for itself. But silence hadn't protected him. It had only emboldened men like Tanner. That ended now. Marcus turned away from the window, the faint hum of his phone vibrating with new notifications. Somewhere out there, the truth was spreading like wildfire. And Marcus? He was ready to see it burn. The morning sun was just beginning to rise, streaking the horizon with pale orange light. Marcus stood at the edge of his driveway, his back straight and shoulders squared. In front of him, a crowd had gathered. Neighbors, reporters, and town officials drawn to his property, like moths to a flame. Parked near the road were two sheriff's cruisers, one of them Tanner's. The man himself stood nearby, arms crossed over his chest, his jaw set as though he were biting back a storm. Marcus had invited this moment. News of Tanner's misconduct had broken overnight. Mitchell and Terrence had ensured that every complaint, every buried accusation, and every scrap of evidence had made its way to the press. Social media was on fire, and the eyes of the state were now firmly fixed on Tanner and his department. But Tanner wasn't a man who went down quietly. Standing between them was the mayor, Margaret Tillman, her face drawn with concern. "Gentlemen, let's handle this calmly," she said, her tone tight but even. "This town doesn't need more of a spectacle." "I agree," Marcus said, his voice steady. "But this isn't a spectacle, Mayor. It's accountability." Tanner let out a sharp laugh, the sound ugly and hollow. "Accountability. That's rich, coming from you." Marcus turned to him, calm as ever. "This isn't about me, Tanner. It's about you, and everything you've done." Tanner's eyes blazed with fury, and he stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "You think you're the hero here? You think anyone cares about your sob story? You don't belong in this town, Bailey. You never did." The crowd fell silent. Tanner's words, laced with venom, hung in the air like smoke. Marcus didn't move, didn't flinch. "What I don't belong in, Tanner, is your world, the one where you abuse your badge to terrorize people you think are beneath you." His voice was sharp now, loud enough for everyone to hear. "But I'm not afraid of you. Not anymore." Tanner took another step, his chest puffed out. Careful, Doc, you're treading on thin ice." "And you've already fallen through," Marcus shot back, his voice ringing clear. "The complaints you thought were buried, They're public now. Your days of hiding behind that badge are over. Tanner's face twisted with rage. You arrogant sheriff! A voice called from the crowd. Tanner stopped mid-step, turning toward the road. A second sheriff's vehicle had pulled up, and from it stepped two men in suits. State investigators. The crowd shifted, murmurs rippling through them as the men approached. Tanner's face paled slightly, but he quickly covered it with a sneer. What's this? Tanner barked. The lead investigator, a tall man with graying hair and a sharp gaze, pulled out a document and handed it to Tanner. Sheriff Greg Tanner, you're hereby suspended pending a full investigation into allegations of misconduct, harassment, and abuse of power. Tanner's hands trembled as he read the words. You can't do this, he growled. This is my jurisdiction. Not anymore, the investigator replied coldly. You'll need to surrender your badge and weapon immediately. Tanner looked around, his gaze darting to the crowd, neighbors, townsfolk, people who'd once trusted him. Now, they watched in silence, their expressions a mixture of disbelief, curiosity, and something Marcus hadn't seen before. Recognition. Wait, Tanner said, his voice faltering for the first time. You can't believe any of this, it's all lies. The investigator didn't respond, instead, holding out his hand. Tanner's defiance began to crack, the reality of his situation sinking in. Slowly, with shaking hands, he unfastened his badge and pulled his gun from its holster, placing them both in the investigator's outstretched hand. Goodbye, Sheriff, Marcus said, his voice calm and steady. Tanner turned to him, his face flushed with humiliation and fury. You think this is over? He spat. You haven't won anything. You'll always be nothing, Bailey. You hear me? Nothing. Marcus didn't respond. He just held Tanner's gaze, unflinching, until the investigators turned and escorted Tanner to the second vehicle. The crowd parted silently, watching as the former sheriff climbed into the back seat. For a moment, Tanner's hateful glare met Marcus's through the car window. Then the door slammed shut, and the vehicle rolled away, leaving a stunned silence in its wake. The crowd lingered in the aftermath, murmuring among themselves as reporters began shouting questions. Mitchell appeared at Marcus's side, his calm voice cutting through the noise. You did it, Mitchell said, clapping Marcus on the shoulder. Marcus nodded slowly, exhaling the breath he'd been holding. We did. You sure you're ready for what comes next? Mitchell asked, his tone cautious. Tanner's gone, but this isn't over. There's still going to be fallout. Marcus turned to him, his face resolute. I'm ready. Later that afternoon, Marcus sat in his study, staring out the window at his property. The quiet was different now, heavier, as though the house itself understood what had just happened. On the desk in front of him sat his laptop, still open to an article about Tanner's suspension. The headline read, Small Town Sheriff Suspended, Amid Allegations of Systemic Harassment. Marcus's phone buzzed beside him, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Terrence. Terrence. More people are coming forward, witnesses. Former deputies. This is bigger than we thought. Marcus read the message twice, his mind already racing. Tanner was just one man, but the system that had protected him for years ran far deeper. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. His phone buzzed again. Another message, this time from a local reporter. Reporter. Dr. Bailey, would you be willing to speak at the town hall meeting tomorrow? People need to hear your side. Marcus hesitated, staring at the message. A part of him wanted to say no, to retreat back into the life he'd worked so hard to build. But the truth was out now, and silence had never served him. Slowly, he typed his response. Marcus. I'll be there. That evening, Marcus sat on his porch, as the sun dipped below the horizon, turning the sky a deep orange. The events of the day played through his mind, each moment etched into his memory. Tanner's words, his rage and desperation, still echoed faintly, but they no longer held power. A car pulled into the driveway, and Marcus stood, recognizing the familiar sleek sedan. Mitchell stepped out, 2 cups of coffee in hand. You figured you'd earned this, Mitchell said, handing one to Marcus. Thanks, Marcus said quietly, taking a sip. They stood together in the quiet, watching as the stars began to emerge. Finally, Mitchell spoke. You really ready to keep fighting this? Marcus nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. This isn't just about Tanner. It's about everyone he hurt, everyone the system ignored. If I don't speak up, nothing changes. Mitchell smiled faintly. That's what I thought you'd say. Marcus turned to him, his expression calm but resolute. I'm not backing down. Good, Mitchell said, raising his cup. Because this fight's just getting started. As the night deepened, Marcus sat back in his chair, the weight of the day finally settling over him. The battle against Tanner was won, but the war for justice was far from over. Tomorrow, he would stand before the town, speak his truth, and refuse to be silenced. Tanner's words had been meant to break him, to make him feel small. But Marcus was still standing, and he wasn't alone anymore. For the first time in a long time, Marcus allowed himself to feel something like hope. This isn't over, he thought, but I'm just getting started. The town hall was packed. Every chair had been filled, and people lined the walls, murmuring in low voices as they waited for the meeting to begin. Reporters with cameras hovered at the edges of the crowd, their lenses ready to capture every moment. The air buzzed with tension, a mixture of curiosity, outrage, and a palpable sense that change was in the air. Marcus sat at the front of the room, flanked by Mitchell and Terrence. The past 24 hours had been a whirlwind. Tanner's suspension had sent shockwaves through the community, and the fallout had only just begun. More former deputies had come forward with stories of Tanner's abuse of power. Local residents, emboldened by the revelations, shared their own experiences of harassment. It wasn't just Tanner on trial anymore. It was the entire system that had allowed him to operate unchecked. Mayor Tillman stepped up to the podium, tapping the microphone to silence the crowd. Thank you all for being here tonight, she began, her voice measured and serious. We've called this meeting to address the recent events involving Sheriff Greg Tanner and the allegations that have come to light. A ripple of murmurs swept through the crowd, but the mayor raised a hand. This is a difficult moment for our town, but it's also an opportunity to acknowledge our failures, to listen, and to do better. Dr. Marcus Bailey has asked to speak, and I believe we owe him the courtesy of hearing him out. She stepped back, motioning for Marcus to take the podium. Marcus stood slowly, his heart pounding as he approached the microphone. The room fell silent. Faces stared back at him, some familiar, some not, some sympathetic, others guarded. He had spent years keeping his head down, choosing silence over conflict. But now, as he stood before his community, Marcus realized that silence had never been safety. It had only been surrender. He cleared his throat, his voice steady as he began. Good evening, he said, his words carrying through the room. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Marcus Bailey. I've lived here for nearly 10 years. I'm a doctor. I've spent my life saving lives, fixing hearts, quite literally. But despite everything I've achieved, I've spent the past few days being treated like I don't belong here. A hush fell over the crowd. I was harassed by Sheriff Tanner for no reason other than the color of my skin and his own prejudices, Marcus continued, his voice strong. And while my story made the headlines, it's not unique. There are others in this room, maybe even some of you, who've been targeted, dismissed, or mistreated because people like Tanner thought they could get away with it. He paused, scanning the faces in the crowd. Some people looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats. Others nodded silently, their eyes filled with recognition. The truth about Greg Tanner has been exposed, Marcus said. But that's not enough. Tanner didn't act alone. He was protected, by silence, by complicity, and by a system that looks the other way when people like me are treated as less than. A low murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Marcus's voice softened, but the fire behind his words remained. I'm not here to divide this community. I'm here because I believe we can do better. This town deserves a sheriff who serves everyone, not just those who look like him. We deserve leaders who don't abuse their power, and it starts here. With us. He stepped back from the podium, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. For a moment, there was silence. Then, from somewhere near the back, a single clap rang out. It was followed by another, and another. Within seconds, the room erupted into applause. Marcus turned to see Mitchell grinning at him. You nailed it, he said quietly. Marcus nodded, though his expression remained thoughtful. This is just the beginning, he thought. In the days that followed, the ripple effect of Marcus's stand continued to spread. Tanner's suspension turned into a full-fledged investigation, uncovering years of corruption, misconduct, and abuse. His former deputies began to cooperate, exposing how Tanner had used his position to target marginalized residents, manipulate evidence, and silence complaints. State officials moved quickly. Tanner was stripped of his badge permanently, and charges of misconduct and abuse of power were filed against him. The headlines that once carried Tanner's name as a symbol of authority now told a different story. Disgraced sheriff faces justice after years of misconduct. At the same time, the town began to change. Residents who had stayed silent out of fear or apathy started speaking up. A local oversight committee was formed to hold the sheriff's department accountable, and new policies were implemented to prevent abuses like Tanner's from happening again. At Lakeview Memorial Hospital, Marcus's colleagues greeted him with newfound respect. Nurses and doctors who had read about his ordeal stopped him in the halls to shake his hand or offer quiet words of support. Some even shared their own stories of discrimination, thanking him for being a voice when so many couldn't. "It's about time someone stood up," one nurse told him. "I'm glad it was you." A week later, Marcus stood on his porch, staring out at the sprawling green fields that surrounded his property. The house was quiet, save for the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. It felt different now. Not like a fortress, but a home. A place where he could stand tall, unafraid. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from Mitchell. "Mitchell." Tanner's pleading out. "They're dropping the hammer on him. You did it, Marcus." Marcus let out a slow breath, his chest filling with something that felt like relief, though he knew the fight wasn't over. Tanner was gone, but the system that had enabled him still lingered, its cracks visible only to those willing to look closely enough. "Dr. Bailey!" Marcus turned to see a familiar face approaching the porch. It was Kyle Thompson, Tanner's former deputy. He looked different without the uniform, more at ease, though still a bit uncertain. "Deputy Thompson," Marcus said, raising an eyebrow. "Just Kyle," the young man replied, offering a small smile. I wanted to thank you for what you did." "You don't need to thank me," Marcus replied. "You chose to do the right thing." Kyle's smile faded slightly. "I should have done it sooner. I let Tanner get away with too much, because I was scared of losing my job." Marcus studied him for a moment before nodding. "Fear keeps a lot of people silent, but it's what you do next that matters." Kyle straightened, determination flickering in his eyes. "I've been talking to the state investigators. I'm giving them everything I know. It's time to clean this up." "Good," Marcus said, offering his hand. "Keep fighting for what's right, Kyle. It's worth it." Kyle shook his hand firmly. "Thanks, Doc." That evening, Marcus sat at his desk, staring at his laptop screen. An email from a civil rights organization sat open, offering him an invitation to speak at their next conference. The thought of stepping into the spotlight again made him hesitate. But only for a moment. He began typing his response. "Marcus, I'd be honored to share my story. Let's make change happen." As the sun set over his property, Marcus stepped outside, letting the cool evening air wash over him. The past few weeks had changed him. He had faced down prejudice, intimidation, and fear. And he had won. He wasn't naive. There were still battles to fight, injustices to expose, but for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt hope. Not just for himself, but for everyone who had been made to feel small, unseen, and unworthy. Tanner had tried to break him, but Marcus had turned his pain into power. And as he looked out over the fields, Marcus knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. A month had passed since Greg Tanner's suspension, but the effects of Marcus's fight lingered like ripples on a still pond, spreading outward. The town of Pine Ridge, once content to let its problems hide in plain sight, was no longer the same. The courthouse steps, the diner booths, and even the quiet corners of Lakeview Memorial Hospital buzzed with conversation, honest, difficult conversations about power, prejudice, and accountability. Marcus stood in his backyard, a cup of coffee in his hand, as he watched the morning sun burn away the remnants of fog over his property. The air was crisp, and the silence around him no longer felt heavy. It felt earned. He had changed. For so long, Marcus had chosen to stay quiet, to believe that his success, his education, his title, his home, could shield him from the ugliness of the world. He had believed that keeping his head down would protect him. But Greg Tanner had proven otherwise. Tanner's words, his actions, and his abuse of power had reminded Marcus of a harsh truth. No amount of success could buy the right to be treated with basic respect when systemic prejudice thrived unchecked. And yet, Marcus hadn't let it break him. Tanner had pushed him, tested him, tried to reduce him to a narrative of helplessness. But Marcus had stood tall. In doing so, he had found his voice again, not just for himself, but for those who didn't have the means or strength to fight. Sometimes silence is surrender, Marcus thought, setting down his coffee. And I refused to surrender. The changes in Pine Ridge had been swift. Though imperfect, Tanner had resigned in disgrace after a mountain of evidence made his reinstatement impossible. Criminal charges hung over him, and the state was now investigating the sheriff's department's handling of harassment complaints under his leadership. But Tanner wasn't the only one. His fall had pulled others into the light. Deputies who had covered for him, local officials who had ignored complaints, neighbors who had chosen to look away. What had been hidden for years could no longer be denied. At a town hall 2 weeks earlier, Marcus had watched from the back as a line of residents stood at the microphone to share their stories. A black teenager recounted being pulled over repeatedly for no reason other than driving through town. A Hispanic business owner described Tanner's condescending questions when he opened his storefront years earlier. The stories, though painful, were finally being heard. For Marcus, that was the victory. Not Tanner's suspension, not the headlines, but the voices. The phone on Marcus's desk buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Mitchell. Mitchell. Just heard from the state office. Pine Ridge is implementing new accountability policies for law enforcement. You started something real, Marcus. Marcus smiled faintly, letting the words sink in. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't the end of racism or prejudice. But it was progress, and progress mattered. His phone buzzed again. This time, a message from a stranger. Thank you for sharing your story. I was afraid to speak up about what happened to me, but you gave me courage. We need more people like you. Marcus stared at the words for a long moment, his chest tight. Messages like this had poured in since the news broke. Stories from people across the country. People he'd never met, but whose experiences mirrored his own. Teachers, doctors, small business owners. Ordinary people who had been made to feel unseen, unheard. It was humbling, and it was a responsibility he didn't take lightly. 2 weeks later, Marcus found himself standing at the podium of a packed conference hall in Atlanta, the bright lights hot on his face. The civil rights organization had invited him to share his story, his fight with Tanner, the fallout, and what it all meant. He scanned the crowd. Activists, students, journalists, ordinary citizens, all of them waiting. He took a steadying breath. For most of my life, Marcus began, I believed that success was the answer. I thought that if I worked hard enough, achieved enough, I could insulate myself from prejudice. I was wrong. A title doesn't make you safe. A house doesn't make you welcome. Silence doesn't make you invisible. The room was quiet, every ear hanging on his words. What happened to me in Pine Ridge isn't unique. People like Greg Tanner exist everywhere, in small towns, big cities, places we think of as safe. They thrive in systems that protect them and silence others. But what Tanner didn't understand is this. Silence doesn't last forever. Truth finds its way to the surface. And when it does, it's up to us to stand and fight for what's right. Marcus paused, letting the weight of his words settle before continuing. Fighting back isn't easy. It's uncomfortable. It's exhausting. It's lonely. But when we stand up, when we speak out, we give others permission to do the same. We show them that fear doesn't win, that dignity doesn't yield. He glanced toward the back of the room, where Mitchell stood watching, his arms crossed and a proud smile on his face. The truth is, change doesn't come from one man. It comes from all of us, speaking up, showing up, and refusing to accept what we know is wrong. My story isn't over, and neither is yours. The room erupted into applause as Marcus stepped back from the microphone. People rose to their feet, clapping and cheering. For the first time, Marcus felt something new settle in his chest, a deep, unwavering sense of purpose. A month later, Marcus returned to Pine Ridge. Life had quieted down, though the changes were still visible. The diner where it all started had a new manager. One who, according to word around town, treated everyone the same. The sheriff's department was undergoing reforms, and a new interim sheriff had already started meeting with residents to rebuild trust. Marcus walked through the small farmer's market on a Saturday morning, nodding politely at those who recognized him. A young black boy ran up to him, clutching a basketball under his arm. "Are you the guy who stood up to the sheriff?" the boy asked, his eyes wide with awe. Marcus knelt to meet his gaze, smiling softly. "I guess I am." The boy grinned. "My mom says you're brave. She says I should always speak up too." "You should," Marcus said. "Your voice matters, never forget that." The boy nodded enthusiastically before running off, disappearing into the crowd. Marcus stood, his heart full. As Marcus sat on his porch that evening, the quiet of his property settling around him, he reflected on how far he had come. He hadn't asked for this fight. He hadn't wanted to be in the spotlight, but life had forced his hand, and in facing the storm head-on, he had discovered something deeper: his strength, his purpose, and his community. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Racism, abuse of power, and prejudice didn't disappear overnight, but Marcus now understood that real change didn't come from avoiding the fight. It came from stepping into it, one person, one voice at a time. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of gold, Marcus let himself smile. This was his home. This was his life, and he wouldn't let anyone take that away from him again. The fight wasn't over, but for now, Marcus was ready to rest, knowing that tomorrow, and every day after, he would be ready to stand again. One voice can start a fire,